The summer of 2024 brought an anomaly to northern Michigan that nobody remembered from the guidebooks. Cedar Lake, which had held steady at 32 feet for more than a generation, began its slow disappearance in mid-June. The drought started soft, a few weeks without rain, nothing that alarmed the seasonal residents or the tourism board. But by early July, the retreat became visible to the naked eye. The shoreline, normally fringed with cattails and boat launches, began to expose long strips of cracked mud and rotting logs that hadn't seen sunlight in decades. The lake had always been a modest body of water by Michigan standards, roughly 4 miles across at its widest point, cradled between two low ridgelines of glacial till. For 70 years, it had been the centerpiece of a small tourism economy, vacation rentals, a public beach, a marina where retirees kept fishing boats. But Cedar Lake was not deep, enough to maintain its own ecological balance during a genuine drought. The water table beneath it, already stressed by agricultural wells miles away, simply couldn't sustain the loss from evaporation and the shallow groundwater seepage that had always been its hidden drain. By the last week of July, the lake level had dropped 9 feet. The exposed bottom became a landscape of its own, a crescent moon of bare, rippled silt that smelled of iron and decay, pocked with the skeletal remains of trees and studded with garbage that had settled over the decades. Shopping carts, rusted barbells, an outboard motor half buried in the sediment. Fishermen who had worked the lake for 20 years found themselves walking out a quarter-mile from the old shoreline, their waders unnecessary. It was on a Tuesday afternoon, July 23rd, when 4 teenagers from the nearby town of Saline drove up to the lake with the specific intention of filming content. Their names were Marcus, Tyler, Ashley, and Jenna, all of them between 16 and 18, all of them operating with the instinct that had defined their entire adolescence. If something unusual exists, it should be documented and uploaded within hours. They had perhaps 15,000 followers across their combined social media accounts, which gave them the sense that they were minor content creators, though in reality they were indistinguishable from 10,000 other regional accounts producing similar material. They parked near the public boat launch and walked out onto the exposed lakebed, their phones already out. The silt made a sound like wet clay under their sneakers, a soft, yielding squelch that Ashley noted felt weirdly post-apocalyptic. They filmed each other standing in the middle of what had been open water. They joked about finding treasures. They posted preliminary clips to TikTok with the hashtag #EarDrainedMichigan, not expecting anything beyond their usual engagement. Then Tyler, who was walking approximately 40 yards from the others, near what had once been the deepest part of the channel, stopped. He called out, not in panic, but in the elevated tone of someone who has found something genuinely unusual. The other 3 converged on his location. What Tyler had spotted was a geometric shape protruding from the silt at an angle. It was dark, weathered, but unmistakably metal. As they drew closer and began to excavate around it with their hands, the shape resolved into a roof panel, then a windshield frame, then a door handle. It was the top of a vehicle. The 4 teenagers stood in a loose semicircle around the discovery, their phones still in their hands, and for perhaps 30 seconds none of them spoke. The sophistication of their content creation deserted them in the face of something that was not curated, not safe, and not designed for entertainment. Tyler was the first to articulate what they were all thinking. "We need to call someone," he said. The 911 call came in at 2:47 p.m. The dispatcher, a woman named Linda Kowalski, who had worked for the Traverse City Area Emergency Services for 19 years initially, thought she was receiving a report about a vehicle accident. But as the caller, who identified himself as Tyler Hendricks, repeated his location and described the object as being completely underwater before today, Linda understood the magnitude. She initiated a multi-agency response, beginning with the Traverse City Police Department, then expanding to include the Grand Traverse County Sheriff's Office and the State Police. Within 40 minutes, the first official personnel arrived at the boat launch. By then, the 4 teenagers had managed to film an additional 20 minutes of content, close-ups of the vehicle's exterior, pan shots of the exposed lakebed, interviews with themselves explaining what they had found. They had posted clips to every platform available to them. The content had begun to circulate. The first law enforcement officer to reach the site was Sheriff's Deputy James Carlson, a man in his early 50s who had worked in Grandie, Traverse County for 28 years. As he walked toward the vehicle, with the 4 teenagers trailing behind him while still filming, he experienced a moment of recognition that he could not immediately place. The vehicle was a van, blue and cream-colored, severely corroded, but still identifiable as a 1989 Dodge Caravan. Carlson had a grandson who was 17 years old. The idea of a family vehicle sitting at the bottom of a lake, waiting to be discovered, was not an abstract tragedy to him. He asked the teenagers to step back. He asked them to stop filming. He said this with sufficient authority that they complied. Then he moved closer to the van's exterior and leaned down to examine the license plate. The plate was obscured by sediment, but he was able to clear away enough mud to read most of the characters. The sequence matched a format he recognized from the 1990s. The final 2 digits were 97. He photographed the plate with his cell phone and called dispatch again, this time asking for them to cross-reference a Michigan license plate number against missing persons reports dating back more than 20 years. It took dispatch approximately 8 minutes to find a match. The van had been registered to a family named Morrison in July 1997. The vehicle had been reported missing on July 19th of that year. The disappearance had been associated with 3 missing persons: Rachel Morrison, age 17, David Chen, age 16, and Thomas Sutton, age 17. All 3 had been presumed drowned after their vehicle was never recovered following a camping trip to the area. Deputy Carlson stood on the exposed lake bed, looking at the corroded shell of a vehicle that had been missing for 27 years, and understood that he was standing in the presence of something that had been simultaneously hidden and visible, lost and waiting, forgotten and about to be remembered by an entire community. By 4:15 p.m. the site was cordoned off. By 5 p.m., news vans from Traverse City and regional outlets had begun to arrive. By 6:30 p.m., the story had reached the evening news broadcasts. By 8 p.m., the teenagers' video, the raw, unfiltered documentation of the discovery, had accumulated more than 700,000 views. News outlets began interviewing each other about the implications. Cable news picked up the story by 9 p.m. What had been a local archaeological curiosity, a vehicle emerging from drought-exposed lakebed, became within hours a national narrative. A 27-year-old cold case, presumed closed, had literally been raised from the water. The parents of Rachel Morrison, David Chen, and Thomas Sutton began receiving phone calls from journalists. The story had a visual anchor point, a clear historical timeline, and the kind of emotional weight that commanded attention. Missing teenagers, undiscovered remains. A mystery that had supposedly been solved decades ago but was now, quite obviously, not solved at all. In the hours after sunset on July 23, 2024, as specialized recovery teams were mobilized and as divers began their preparations for the following morning, the drained lake became a liminal space between what was known and what was about to be revealed. The van sat in the exposed silt like an artifact, like a time capsule, like a grave that had been waiting for the water to withdraw before it could finally be examined. The house at 1847 Maple Street had been empty for 6 weeks when Detective Sarah Brennan finally found the courage to sort through her father's home office. Thomas Brennan had died of a heart attack on June 2, 2024, at the age of 71, leaving behind a 40-year career in law enforcement and a daughter who had followed him into the profession despite his gentle attempts to discourage her. The funeral had been well attended. Retired cops, prosecutors, even a judge who had driven up from Lansing. They all told the same stories about Tom Brennan's meticulous casework, his refusal to let go of investigations that others had written off, his habit of keeping duplicate files at home because he didn't trust the department's record-keeping. Sarah had inherited the house along with everything in it. She'd been putting off the office, focusing instead on easier rooms, donating his clothes, selling furniture, boxing up kitchen items for Goodwill. But the office was different. The office was where her father had spent his evenings for as long as she could remember, bent over case files with a cup of coffee that had gone cold hours earlier, making notes in the margins with his distinctive left-handed scrawl. The room still smelled like him, Old Spice, and coffee and the particular mustiness of aging paper. 4 filing cabinets lined one wall, each drawer labeled with date ranges going back to 1983. His desk, A massive oak piece that had belonged to Sarah's grandfather was covered with neat stacks of folders, legal pads, and 3 different calculators because he never trusted computers for important math. The walls were covered with corkboards, maps of Grand Traverse County, and photographs from cases that had meant something to him. Sarah started with the desk drawers, finding the expected detritus of a long career, expired ID badges, boxes of paper clips, bottles of whiteout that had long since dried solid. In the bottom drawer, wrapped in a plastic grocery bag, she found something that made her pause. A Smith & Wesson .38 Special, her father's off-duty weapon from the 1990s. She hadn't known he'd kept it. Beneath the gun was a manila envelope marked "Personal Do Not File" in red ink. Inside the envelope were documents she didn't recognize, photocopies of witness statements, a hand-drawn map of Cedar Lake with X marks at various points along the shoreline, and a business card for Benson Industries with a phone number circled multiple times. But what caught her attention were the photographs. They were Polaroids, the kind that had been ubiquitous in the 1990s before digital cameras changed everything. The white borders had yellowed slightly, but the images were still sharp. 3 teenagers at what was obviously a party, red Solo cups in hand, arms around each other's shoulders, the casual intimacy of kids who had known each other forever. Sarah recognized the location immediately, the public beach at Cedar Lake, the same pavilion that still stood there, though it had been renovated twice since these photos were taken. She flipped the first photo over. Her father's handwriting, Rachel Morrison, David Chen, Thomas Sutton. July 11, 1997, 1 week before disappearance. Sarah sat down hard in her father's desk chair. She knew these names. Everyone who had worked law enforcement in northern Michigan knew these names. The Cedar Lake Three, as the media had called them. Teenagers who had gone camping and never come home. Their van never found despite extensive searches. Presumed drowned when an empty canoe washed up on shore 3 days after they were reported missing. The case that had defined the summer of 1997 for the entire region. She spread the Polaroids across the desk. There were 7 in total, all from the same roll of film, judging by the consistent color tone and degradation pattern. In one, Rachel Morrison was laughing at something off camera. Her dark hair caught mid-motion. She wore a Smashing Pumpkins t-shirt and had the kind of easy confidence that made her seem older than 17. David Chen was captured mid-sentence in another photo, gesturing with his hands, wearing a backwards baseball cap and a hemp necklace that screamed 1997. Thomas Sutton appeared in profile in most shots, quieter than the others, often looking at Rachel when he thought the camera wasn't on him. But it was the last photo that made Sarah's breath catch. It showed all 3 teenagers standing by a blue and cream Dodge Caravan, the same vehicle that had just been pulled from Cedar Lake according to the news reports she'd been following all day. But in this photo, there was a 4th person, partially visible at the edge of the frame, just a shoulder and part of a face, but enough to show it was an adult, not another teenager, someone who had been cropped out of the story. Sarah found her father's case notes in a folder beneath the photos. The official report was there, the one filed with the department, stamped "Case closed, accidental, drowning," but behind it were pages and pages of handwritten notes that had never made it into any official file. Her father had interviewed people who weren't in the official record. He'd drawn timeline charts that showed discrepancies in the witness statements. He'd collected weather data, showing that the lake had been calm the night the teenagers disappeared, contradicting the official theory of a canoe accident in rough water. One note, written in red ink and underlined 3 times, read, "Search focused on North Shore based on current patterns." But Morrison's car found its south launch. Why would they paddle north against prevailing wind? Another note, paper clipped to a map. Benson security guard saw a van at 11:45 p.m. Kids reported, missing at 8 a.m. Guard changed story, said he was mistaken about date. Check his bank records. Sarah pulled out her phone and searched for news about the van recovery. The latest update said divers would begin searching the interior tomorrow morning. She looked back at the Polaroids, at these 3 kids frozen in time, unaware that they had less than a week left. Her father had never mentioned this case to her, never brought it up during their regular dinners or their discussions about cold cases. But here was evidence that he'd never let it go, that he'd been building a parallel investigation for 27 years. She found a cassette tape at the bottom of the folder, labeled simply, Chen Interview 1999. Her father's old tape recorder was still in the closet. She inserted the tape and pressed play. Her father's younger voice filled the room, formal but kind. The voice she remembered from her childhood when he was still working patrol. This is Detective Thomas Brennan, badge number 4827, conducting a follow-up interview with Amy Chen, sister of David Chen. Date is March 15th, 1999. Amy, I want you to know this is unofficial. I'm recording for my own records, but this won't be filed with the department. Can you tell me again about the last time you spoke to your brother? A young woman's voice, thick with emotion even 2 years after the loss. It was the morning they left. July 18th. David called me from Rachel's house. He said they were excited about the camping trip, but there was something else. He said they had something important to do first. Something about Rachel's project. I asked what project, but he just said I'd find out when they got back. He said they were going to make a difference. Did he mention anyone else who might be involved? Anyone they were planning to meet? No, but... Detective Brennan, I need to tell you something. After David went missing, I went through his room. I found a notebook where he'd been keeping track of something at the old quarry. Dates and times like he was watching for patterns. There were chemical formulas I didn't understand. I gave it to the police, but they said it wasn't relevant to the search. They never gave it back. The tape continued for another 20 minutes. Amy Chen described her brother's growing interest in environmental science, his friendship with Rachel Morrison that had started in AP chemistry, his conviction that local companies were poisoning the watershed. She mentioned that Rachel had been taking photographs all summer, documenting things, but nobody knew what had happened to her camera. Sarah stopped the tape. She looked at the Polaroids again, studying them with a detective's eye now rather than a daughter's grief. In the background of one photo, barely visible, was a sign. Private Beach, Benson Industries Company. Picnic. The teenagers hadn't been at the public beach at all. They'd been at a corporate event, taking pictures, 1 week before they disappeared. She pulled out her laptop and began cross-referencing dates. Benson Industries had closed their quarry operation in September 1997, just 2 months after the teenagers went missing. The official reason was economic downturn, but the timing was suspicious. Her father had made a note about EPA complaints that had been filed and then mysteriously withdrawn. As she dug deeper into the files, Sarah found more photographs, not Polaroids this time, but official crime scene photos from the search. They showed the empty canoe that had been found. But her father had noticed something the official investigators had missed or ignored. In his notes, canoe shows no signs of impact damage. Paddles still secured. If kids capsized in rough water, why didn't they deploy paddles? The final item in the folder was a sealed envelope marked, "To be opened only if case reopens." Sarah hesitated, then tore it open. Inside was a single sheet of paper with 5 names and addresses, titled Witnesses Afraid to Come Forward in 1997. Below that, in her father's handwriting, "If the van is ever found, start here." The truth is in the details they made us ignore. Sarah sat back in her father's chair, surrounded by the evidence of his secret investigation. Outside, she could hear sirens in the distance, probably heading to Cedar Lake where the recovery operation was being staged. She thought about her father, working alone on this case for decades, keeping his findings secret even from his own daughter. He must have known that without the van, without the bodies, he had nothing but theories and suspicious coincidences. But now the van had been found. Now there was physical evidence. Now the case that had haunted her father could finally be pursued with the full weight of law enforcement behind it. She picked up the Polaroid of the 3 teenagers by their van, studying their faces. Rachel Morrison with her confident smile, David Chen with his animated gestures, Thomas Sutton with his quiet intensity. They'd been dead for 27 years, but in this photo they were eternal teenagers, full of plans and secrets and the absolute certainty that they were going to change the world. Sarah began to organize the files, preparing to take them to the department in the morning. But first, she had calls to make. 5 witnesses who had been afraid to come forward in 1997 might be willing to talk now. The truth, as her father had written, was in the details they made us ignore. As she worked, she found herself talking to her father's empty chair, a habit she'd developed in the weeks since his death. "I'll finish this, Dad. Whatever you started, whatever you found, I'll see it through. I promise." The room seemed to approve. The weight of all those files and photographs and careful notes settling around her like a familiar coat. Outside, the summer evening was fading into night, but in the office at 1847 Maple Street, Sarah Brennan was just beginning to understand the case that had defined the last 27 years of her father's life. The sun rose over Cedar Lake on July 24th, 2024, casting long, distorted shadows across the vast expanse of exposed mudflats. Detective Sarah Brennan arrived at the scene just after 6 a.m., the air already thick with the smell of damp, earth and diesel fumes from the generators, powering the forensic lights. The previous day's media circus had been replaced by a grim, focused operation. The blue and cream Dodge Caravan, now officially identified as belonging to the Morrison family, sat partially embedded in the silt, approximately 150 yards from the original shoreline, tilted at a precarious 30-degree angle. Its roof and upper sections were exposed, but the lower doors and windows were swallowed by the thick, anaerobic mud that had preserved it for nearly 3 decades. Brennan pulled on her waders, the rubber heavy and unfamiliar against her legs, and joined the lead forensic anthropologist, Dr. Lena Petrova, near the command tent. Petrova, a woman in her late 50s with sharp eyes and a voice that cut through the noise, briefed her without preamble. "The divers are prepping," she stated, gesturing towards the murky waterline, where 2 figures were adjusting scuba gear. "The sediment is incredibly dense. We're using a grid system, slow and deliberate. No rushing. Preservation is key. The van's been sealed in an oxygen-free environment for 27 years. What's inside could be delicate." Brennan nodded, her gaze fixed on the van. It looked less like a vehicle and more like a relic, a time capsule. The rust had bloomed in intricate patterns across the metal, and the once blue paint was now a faded, chalky white in places. The windows were opaque with grime. She thought of the Polaroid in her pocket, the 3 teenagers laughing beside this very van, unaware of the fate awaiting them just days later. The disconnect was jarring. The first dive team entered the water, their movements slow and measured, kicking up minimal silt. They approached the van cautiously, using underwater scoops and soft brushes to clear the immediate area around the driver's side door. The camera mounted on the lead diver's helmet provided a grainy, distorted feed on a monitor inside the command tent. Brennan watched intently as the diver worked, her knuckles white where she gripped the edge of the table. The driver's door was jammed shut, likely by the pressure of the mud and the impact. The diver shifted focus to the sliding side door on the passenger side. With careful application of a pry bar and controlled force, it groaned open, hinges protesting after decades of disuse. A wave of sediment-clouded water surged out, carrying with it a cascade of small objects that tumbled onto the exposed mud below the open door. Inside the van, the diver's light beam cut through the murk, revealing the interior. Brennan's breath caught. The space was astonishingly preserved. The dashboard was cracked, but the vinyl seats, though covered in a fine layer of silt, weren't rotted. The steering wheel was intact. The driver's side floor was littered with the objects that had spilled out. A small mud-caked backpack, a plastic water bottle, a folded map. But it was the objects still inside that drew the diver's attention. And now Brennan's. The diver carefully worked the camera around, showcasing the interior. On the front passenger seat, partially buried, lay a heavy silver ring. The camera zoomed in. It was a class ring, unmistakably from Traverse City Central High School, class of 1997. The initial T was visible on the stone. Brennan recognized it instantly from the missing persons reports. Thomas Sutton's ring. On the back seat, nestled against the door, sat a portable CD player. It was a Sony Discman, a model popular in the late 90s. The diver carefully picked it up, handling it with the reverence one might give a fragile artifact. A disc was still inside. The diver ejected it carefully. The label was visible, Bringing Down the Horse by the Wallflowers. Released in 1996, a hit in 1997, a detail that anchored the timeline. Brennan watched, her mind racing. The driver's side footwell revealed a wallet, waterlogged but intact. The diver carefully opened it. The driver's license of Rachel Morrison fell out, her 17-year-old photo staring back, her dark hair pulled back, her expression serious. Beside it, David Chen's ID card and Thomas Sutton's Social Security card tucked into a clear plastic sleeve. All present, all accounted for, yet no bodies. The diver continued the systematic search. Beneath the driver's seat, partially obscured by mud, was a small cylindrical object. It was a cassette tape case, waterproof, still sealed. The diver retrieved it. The label was handwritten, Rachel, Night Thoughts. A potential diary, a potential key. The most significant discovery, however, came from the rear cargo area. Tucked against the back of the front seats, partially covered by a tarp, was a two-person dome tent. It was brand new, tags still attached and meticulously packed. Every pole was in its sleeve, every stake secured in its pouch. The sleeping bags inside were rolled tight, unused. There wasn't a speck of mud or debris inside the tent itself. It was pristine, as if it had never been opened. Dr. Petrova leaned closer to the monitor, her brow furrowed. "That's highly unusual," she murmured. "For a camping trip, especially one where they plan to stay overnight. The tent would be the first thing set up, yet it's packed as if it never left the store. And look at the mud on the floor of the van. It's deep, consistent. They drove in, parked, and what? They left the van. But where did they go? And why didn't they set up the tent?" Brennan stared at the image of the packed tent on the monitor. It was a stark contradiction to the official narrative of a tragic camping accident. If they'd planned to camp, the tent would be out, set up. If they'd planned something else, why bring the tent at all? And the sheer volume of personal artifacts, the ring, the Discman, the IDs, the tape, suggested they hadn't planned on abandoning the vehicle so quickly. The divers worked for another hour, meticulously cataloging every visible item, photographing and mapping their positions before any removal began. They confirmed the absence of any visible human remains within the passenger compartment. The driver's seat was empty. The front passenger seat held the ring and the Discman. The back seat held the wallet and IDs. The cargo area held the packed tent and a small cooler, its contents long since decayed beyond recognition. By 9:30 a.m., the van was secured, and the initial artifact recovery was underway. Each item was carefully cleaned of loose mud, photographed in situ, then placed in an evidence bag labeled with precise coordinates. Sarah Brennan stood beside the mud-caked van, the early morning sun, warming her face but doing little to dispel the chill that had settled deep in her bones. The packed tent sat on a tarp nearby, a silent, pristine monument to an interrupted journey. The artifacts spoke of 3 lives abruptly cut short, of plans made and abandoned, of a mystery that had just become infinitely more complex. Her father's notes, the Polaroids, the discrepancies, they all converged here, in the preserved interior of a van that held answers, but not the ones she expected. The bodies weren't here. The truth, it seemed, was buried deeper, somewhere beyond the reach of the drained lake bed. The interview room at the Grand Traverse County Sheriff's office smelled of stale coffee and industrial cleaner, a scent Sarah Brennan had associated with bad news for her entire career. She sat opposite Amy Chen, who now went by Amy Miller after marriage, a woman whose face held the delicate fragility of bone china, but whose eyes held the hard, unyielding depth of a lake that had swallowed something it shouldn't have. Amy was 44, a librarian at the Traverse City Public Library, her dark hair streaked with silver at the temples, her hands folded neatly on the table but trembling slightly. 27 years had passed, but the loss was still raw, still visible in the set of her shoulders, the way she avoided direct eye contact until Sarah placed a single, clear evidence bag on the table between them. Inside the bag lay 3 items: the Traverse City Central High School class ring, its silver tarnished but the initial T still visible, the Sony Discman, the plastic case cracked but intact, and Rachel Morrison's driver's license, the 17-year-old photo staring out with an unnerving clarity. Sarah watched Amy's reaction closely. The woman's breath hitched. Her fingers, which had been still, now twitched as if reaching for the bag. She didn't touch it, but her gaze locked onto her brother's ring. "That's David's," she whispered, the voice thin and reedy. "Thomas must have had it with him." Why is it here? Why isn't he—" The question trailed off, unspoken but hanging heavy in the air. Why isn't he inside the van? "Where is he?" Sarah leaned forward slightly, keeping her voice low, calm. "Amy, we found the van yesterday. It was buried in the mud at Cedar Lake, but the bodies weren't inside. Just these things, and a tent, packed like they never used it. Your brother's ID, Rachel's, Thomas's social security card. The official report from 1997 said they drowned, that their canoe was found empty. But nothing adds up. Not anymore. I need to know what you remember. Amy, everything. Especially anything you didn't tell the police back then. Anything you kept to yourself. Amy's gaze shifted from the evidence bag to Sarah's face. There was a flicker of recognition. Perhaps not of Sarah personally, but of the Brennan name. Her father, Tom Brennan, had interviewed her twice in 1997 and once more in 1999. Always gentle, always persistent. Amy had been 17 when David disappeared, a child herself, terrified and grieving. She'd told the police what she thought they needed to hear, the camping trip, the excitement, the last phone call from David where he'd sounded happy. She'd hidden the notebook. The last time I saw him, Amy began, her voice gaining a fraction of strength, though it remained brittle, was the morning they left. July 18th, 1997. He came over to our house early. Mom was at work. I was still in pajamas. He was buzzing. Not just about camping. He kept saying, "Amy, you're going to be so proud. Rachel's got something big. We're going to make a difference." I asked what he meant. He said, "Oh, just wait. We'll show you when we get back." He kissed my forehead, told me to have a good week, and left with his backpack. He was carrying that new camera Rachel's dad gave him. A Minolta something. He took pictures constantly then. Sarah made a note. Camera. Missing. Did he mention anyone else? Anyone they were meeting? No, just the three of them. Thomas, Rachel, David. They were inseparable. Like they shared one brain sometimes. A faint, sad smile touched her lips, quickly extinguished. But later that night, after they were reported missing, I went into David's room. I needed to feel close to him. I found his journal. Not the diary he wrote in every day, but a separate notebook, bound in black leather. He kept it hidden under his mattress. Inside, it was terrifying. What was in it, Amy? Sarah prompted gently. Dates, times, places, mostly the old Benson quarry. He'd been going out there for weeks, at night. Sometimes alone, sometimes with Rachel. He wrote about chemical smells, weird colors in the water, barrels being moved. He had sketches, formulas, notes about pH levels. He thought Benson Industries was dumping illegal waste into the watershed. Something toxic. He said Rachel had been taking pictures of it all summer. She called it Project Clean Slate. Amy's voice dropped to a near whisper. He said they were going to confront someone the night they disappeared. He wrote, "Tonight's the night." Got the proof. Going to the quarry. Meeting the source. They'll listen now. Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. The source? Who was the source? I don't know. He never said a name. Just the source. He said this person was scared but had evidence too. That's why they were meeting. I found the notebook when the police were searching his room. I showed it to your father, Tom Brennan. He took it. He said it was important. But then, later, when I asked about it, he just said it wasn't relevant to finding them, that it was probably just teenage environmental stuff. But it wasn't just stuff, Sarah. It was detailed, obsessive. He was scared but determined, and then they disappeared. The notebook? I never got it back. They said it was lost in the files. Sarah's mind raced. Her father's notes mentioned the notebook. The withdrawal of EPA complaints, the sudden closure of the quarry. This was the missing link. Amy, what happened to that camera? The Minolta? I don't know. The police never found it. Rachel's dad said she always carried it. She had a strap. It should have been with her, in the van, or with her body if they drowned. But it wasn't. And the notebook? If your father had it, if he believed it was important, why didn't it change anything? Why did they just write it off as an accident? The question hung unanswered, heavy in the small room. Sarah looked at the evidence bag again, at the ring, the discman, the license. These weren't just artifacts. They were breadcrumbs leading away from the official story. Amy's testimony wasn't just memory. It was an accusation, a confession of suppressed knowledge that pointed directly towards corporate malfeasance and a cover-up far darker than a simple drowning accident. I need to see that notebook, Amy, Sarah said, her voice firm now. Or copies of what was in it. Your father's notes might have it, but if he kept a copy, anything you remember, any detail, the formulas, the dates, the sketch of the quarry layout, it might be the key to understanding why they weren't in the van, why the quarry closed, why your father kept investigating this for 27 years. Amy took a shaky breath, her eyes finally meeting Sarah's directly. There was fear there, but also a desperate, weary hope. I kept something, she admitted, her voice barely audible. After the second interview with your father, I was scared. Scared of what they might do if they knew what David really knew. so I copied pages from his notebook before the police took the original. Just a few pages, the ones with the most damning stuff. The dates, the formulas, the sketch of the access road at the quarry where the barrels were dumped. I hid them in a box of old high school yearbooks in my attic. I haven't looked at them since your father died last month. Sarah leaned forward, her heart pounding. Can I see them, Amy, please? It could be what brings David, Rachel, and Thomas home. What finally tells you what happened. Amy nodded slowly, a single tear tracing a path down her cheek. Yes, I'll get them. But Sarah, be careful. Whoever did this, whoever silenced them, they were powerful. They covered it up for 27 years. Finding the truth might be dangerous. She looked at the evidence bag again, at her brother's ring. But maybe it's time someone was afraid of us. For a change, she pushed her chair back, stood up, and walked out of the interview room, leaving Sarah alone with the silence and the weight of the cold case that was suddenly, terrifyingly alive again. The cassette tape arrived in an evidence bag marked Exhibit 7, its plastic case warped by decades of pressure and moisture. Detective Sarah Brennan handled it with nitrile gloves, the weight of it feeling unnervingly solid in her palm. It had been recovered from the glove compartment of the Dodge Caravan, wedged beneath a stack of faded road maps. The label, handwritten in blue ink, was barely legible. Rachel, Night Thoughts, Side A. Below it, in smaller, neater script, July 18, 1997 1. The date matched the disappearance. The forensic audio lab was a sterile, white room humming with the low thrum of equipment. Sarah watched as technician Marcus Alvarez, a man whose hands moved with the precision of a watchmaker, carefully cleaned the cassettes, exterior with a soft brush and isopropyl alcohol. The label flaked slightly under the brush. It's remarkably preserved, Marcus murmured, his voice amplified slightly by the lab's acoustics. The tape itself is brittle, but the housing kept most contaminants out. We'll digitize it, but the signal might be fragile, especially towards the end. Marcus slid the cassette into a restored Tascam 122 McCurd cassette deck, a vintage machine capable of handling degraded tapes. He connected it to a digital audio workstation. The room fell silent except for the faint whir of the deck's transport mechanism. Marcus hit play. For a moment there was only the soft hiss of tape decay, like wind through dry reeds. Then a voice emerged, young and clear, cutting through the noise. Hey, it's Rachel. July 10th, almost midnight. Just got back from the quarry, again. David's asleep, but I had to get this down. It's worse than we thought. The water near the old drum pit. It's glowing. Like, actually glowing. Greenish blue. Like something from a sci-fi movie. David took samples today, sealed them in glass jars. He's scared, but he won't stop. He says if we can prove it's toxic, Benson Industries has to clean it up. Mom thinks I'm crazy. Obsessed with this Project Clean Slate, but she doesn't see the dead fish. She doesn't smell the chemicals. This isn't just about a grade, Sarah. This is about people getting sick, maybe dying. Sarah leaned closer to the monitor displaying the audio waveform. The initial recording was steady, the voice confident. Rachel described the location, the drum pit at the far end of the Benson quarry, a place marked no trespassing on the maps they'd found. She mentioned the Minolta camera constantly clicking, capturing images of the barrels, the stained earth, the discoloration in the creek, feeding into Cedar Lake. There was the rustle of a sleeping bag as she shifted, the distant hoot of an owl. The soundscape felt intimate, like eavesdropping on a private moment. The recording continued over the next few nights. July 12th. Rachel described finding discarded chemical drums near the access road, their labels scratched off. They're hiding something. Her voice crackled with tension. July 13th. She talked about meeting someone. The source, as David called them, near the old guard shack late at night. A woman scared, who claimed she'd seen trucks dumping barrels under cover of darkness. She gave us names, dates, places. We're compiling it. It's real, Sarah. This is big. Bigger than we thought. Then the mood shifted dramatically. The recording from July 17th. The night before they disappeared started with the sound of rain pattering on the van's roof. Rachel's voice was strained, breathless. It's 11:15 p.m. We're parked near the south entrance to the quarry. David and Thomas are asleep. I can't sleep. The source called. Said something's wrong. Said the company knows we're onto them. Said they're watching us. I heard something outside. Footsteps? Crashing in the bushes. David woke up. He heard it too. He's got the camera ready. He's scared, but he's not backing down. He says if anything happens to us, we've already sent copies of everything to someone safe. Project Clean Slate goes live if we disappear. That's what he said. I just want this night to be over. The hiss on the tape intensified. The waveform became jagged, erratic. Sarah saw Marcus's knuckles whiten on the controls. The next entry, dated July 18th, started abruptly. No preamble. Just the sound of rain, heavier now. And Rachel's voice, low and urgent, barely above a whisper, punctuated by the sharp click of the camera's shutter. It's 11:47 p.m. We're not at the quarry anymore. We drove back towards the lake. Someone followed us. I saw headlights. Big truck, no plates. Pulled over just past the old logging road. They got out. Men, 4 of them, not uniforms. Dark clothes. They're yelling. David's filming. Thomas is trying to calm him. I'm hiding. In the back. Under a blanket. Oh God, they're arguing. About the samples. About the files. One voice. Older. Angry. You kids have no idea what you're messing with. Another voice. Younger. Cold. Just make it look like an accident. The truck engine started. They're leaving. But wait, one of them. He's coming towards the van. He's got something. A crowbar. He's prying the driver's door. David's still filming. He's whispering, Rachel, run. But I can't leave Thomas. The crowbar. It's hitting the window. Glass breaking. Oh God, I hear Thomas scream, David. David's shouting something. You can't do this. We have proof. The crowbar. It's coming down. I'm screaming, but no sound comes out. I see the man's face. Partially. In the headlights. And he's looking right at the window where I'm hiding. And he smiles. And then, the recording ended abruptly. Not a fade out, not a click. It was a violent, jarring snap. The sound of tape physically breaking. The waveform on the monitor dissolved into a solid block of digital noise. The hiss stopped. The silence in the lab was absolute, thick and suffocating. Marcus slowly ejected the cassette. The tape inside was visibly frayed near the point where it had snapped. He looked at Sarah, his face pale. That wasn't degradation, he stated, his voice flat with shock. That was physical damage, intentional. Someone broke the tape. Right at the end. Right when whatever happened. Sarah stared at the broken cassette in Marcus's gloved hand. Rachel's terrified whispers echoed in her mind. They found us. You can't do this. He's looking right at the window. The smile. The crowbar. The broken tape. It wasn't an accident. It wasn't drowning. It was a targeted attack, executed by men connected to Benson Industries. Her father's notes about the missing security logs. The dropped EPA case, the $5,000 payoff. They weren't just suspicious coincidences anymore. They were pieces of a mosaic, depicting cold-blooded murder and a meticulously maintained cover-up for 27 years. The artifact wasn't just evidence. It was a confession trapped in plastic and oxide. Rachel Morrison's final moments weren't lost to time. They were preserved. A desperate, terrified message from the past, delivered directly to Sarah's ears. The open loop wasn't just a question of what happened. It was the chilling realization of who had done it, and the terrifying certainty that they were still out there, powerful, protected, and willing to kill again to keep their secrets buried. The cassette had reframed the case entirely, transforming it from a tragic cold case into a deadly, ongoing conspiracy. The Grand Traverse County records. Annex was a windowless basement smelling of mildew and decaying paper, the kind of place where inconvenient truths went to die. Detective Sarah Brennan spent 3 days there, her eyes burning from the fluorescent lights and the fine dust that coated every surface. She worked systematically, starting with the official Benson Industries file, a thick, red-spine binder labeled Environmental Compliance, 1995-1997. The contents were meticulously organized, every permit application, inspection report, and correspondence filed in chronological order. She found the EPA violations easily enough. 3 notices of violation dated between March and June 1997, citing improper storage of hazardous materials, failure to maintain secondary containment, and unpermitted discharge into the Cedar Lake watershed. Each violation carried a potential fine of up to $25,000 per day. The company's response was a string of delays and promises of corrective action. Brennan cross-referenced the EPA file with the Michigan Department of Environmental Quality DQ case files, accessed via a dusty terminal in the corner. The DQ file was thinner, It contained copies of the EPA violations and Benson's responses. But there was a gap, a significant one. Between June 15th and July 20th, 1997, the file was empty. No follow-up inspections, no enforcement orders, no communication whatsoever. It was as if the entire environmental agency had gone on vacation during the most critical period of the violations, the exact period the teenagers had been investigating and then disappeared. She pulled out her father's notes, the ones she'd copied from his home office. He'd circled the dates. June 18th, 1997, EPA Agent Miller calls. Says case closed due to lack of evidence. Miller transferred to Lansing. July 1st. Brennan frowned. Lack of evidence? The EPA had the violations. They had Benson's own admission of problems. She dug deeper into the DEQ archives, pulling personnel records for the Grand Traverse Regional Office. She found the transfer order for Agent Miller, effective. July 1st, 1997. Coincidence? Or a reward for silence? She noted the name. Senator Michael Benson's office number was found in Miller's Rolodex under B contact. Her focus shifted to the physical evidence recovered from the van, the heavy silver class ring, the discman, the IDs, and Amy Chen's revelation about David's notebook detailing illegal dumping. She needed proof of the means. She requested Benson Industries purchase orders for the summer of 1997. The records were stored on microfiche, requiring a bulky reader. The first 100 orders were routine, office supplies, vehicle maintenance, safety gear. Then she found it. Order B743, dated July 18, 1997. 3 industrial-grade drums of white sodium hydroxide, lye. Quantity, 300 gallons. Delivery location, Benson Quarry. Approved by Thomas Benson Sr., CEO. Signed by Logistics Manager. Brennan's breath hitched. Lye, highly corrosive. Used in industrial cleaning, but also a known method for destroying organic evidence. The date was the same day the teenagers disappeared. The quantity was staggering. And the delivery location was the quarry, the very place David and Rachel had documented dumping. It wasn't just circumstantial. It was a direct link between the company and the potential disposal method of the teens' bodies and evidence. She cross-referenced the order with the concrete plant's delivery logs, which she'd managed to obtain through a records request. The logs showed a concrete delivery to the Cedar Lake access road at 3:17 a.m. on July 20th, 1997. The truck number matched one owned by the plant. The driver's name was smudged, but the destination was clear. Benson site. This matched perfectly with the discovery of the concrete-sealed drums found during the lakebed mapping, Section 8. The teens were dead by July 19th. The drums containing them were sealed in concrete on July 20th, paid for by Benson Industries just 2 days earlier. The final damning piece came from the county clerk's office. She pulled the corporate filings for Benson Industries. She found the articles of amendment filed on their August 5th, 1997. It listed the dissolution of the Quarry Operations Division, effective September 30th, 1997. The reason cited, economic downturn. But the dissolution paperwork was signed by Thomas Benson Sr. and witnessed by a junior attorney named Helen Croft, the same name listed as the contact in Agent Miller's transferred Rolodex entry. Croft was now a senior partner at a powerful Lansing law firm known for representing corporate interests. Brennan laid the documents out on the grimy table. The EPA violations, the empty DEQ gap, the lye purchase order dated July 18th, the concrete delivery at 3:17 a.m. July 20th, the dissolution paperwork signed by Benson Sr. and witnessed by the lawyer linked to the EPA agent's transfer. Each document was a stone, and together they formed a clear, undeniable path. The cover-up wasn't just negligence. It was a deliberate, coordinated effort by the highest levels of Benson Industries, potentially aided or abetted by officials within the EPA and DEQ, to bury the environmental crimes and, crucially, the murders of the teenagers who uncovered them. The paper trail wasn't just evidence. It was a confession written in ink and stamped with official seals, proving the conspiracy her father suspected had been real all along. As she packed the documents, a cold dread settled over her. She wasn't just solving a cold case anymore. She was about to confront a powerful institution that had successfully hidden its crimes for nearly 3 decades. The next step wouldn't be in dusty archives. It would be in the shadows, where the architects of the cover-up still operated. Marcus Webb's hospice room was a space suspended between life and death, smelling of antiseptic and the faint, sweet decay of a body shutting down. Detective Sarah Brennan stood beside the bed, the air thick with the rasp of his shallow breaths. He was a shell, really. His skin the color of wet paper stretched over fragile bones, but his eyes held a fierce, burning intelligence that defied his physical dissolution. He'd been a security guard at the Benson Quarry in 1997, a job he'd taken after a tour in Vietnam. Left him with a permanent limp and a deep-seated distrust of institutions. He'd kept his silence for 27 years, a silence paid for in cash and maintained by fear. "Detective," he rasped, his voice a dry whisper like sandpaper on bone. He'd been expecting her. The nurse had told him Sarah was coming. He'd known it was time. "You found the van. Cedar Lake. Took you long enough." A weak, humorless smile touched his lips. "Tom Brennan," he asked me once. Told him to forget. Said it was for the best. He was wrong. Sarah pulled the chair closer, the wood scraping softly on the linoleum floor. She kept her voice low, a calm counterpoint to his ragged breathing. "Mr. Webb, I need you to tell me everything. About July 18th, 1997. What you saw. Who was there. Everything." Marcus closed his eyes for a long moment, then opened them again, his gaze fixed on the ceiling tiles, as if seeing the past projected there. "Night shift, midnight. I was doing my rounds. The new security system was glitchy, so I was on foot. Saw the kid's van parked near the south gate. Blue and cream. Dodge Caravan. Weird spot. Nobody parked there. Not even company trucks. I approached quiet, flashlight off. Heard voices, arguing, loud." He paused, his breath catching in a painful rattle. A man's voice, older, gravelly, angry, sounded like Thomas Benson Sr. He was yelling at someone younger. "They have the proof, you fool! We can't let this get out." Then I saw them, 4 men, 2 in dark suits, not uniforms. 2 in coveralls, but they weren't mine. They weren't quarry workers. They were dragging the kids out of the van. Rachel was screaming. David was fighting. Thomas was just standing there, frozen, like a statue in a nightmare. Sarah's knuckles were white where she gripped the chair arms. Dragging them where? Into the quarry? No, into a van. Black panel van. No windows. I saw Thomas Benson Jr. He was just a kid then. Maybe 25. He was holding a crowbar. Smashed the driver's side window. Glass shattered everywhere. He looked cold, not scared, furious like they were insects. He shoved David into the van. Then Rachel. Thomas Sutton. He was just gone. Vanished, like he was never there. Marcus Webb's eyes filled with tears that didn't fall. Trapped in the dry wells of his sockets. I was scared, terrified. I hid behind a stack of chemical drums. I saw them load the bodies into the back of the van. Then they drove off. Towards the lake. I didn't follow. I couldn't. I just went back to the guard shack and drank until I passed out. The next day, the story was accident. Drowned. I knew it was a lie. But the money? The threat. I kept my mouth shut. Sarah pulled out her notepad, her hand steady despite the turmoil inside her. "Do you remember any names? Any details? Anything?" One of the suits had a scar, right side of his face, from eyebrow to jawline, like he'd been cut with a knife. The other suit had a gold signet ring, a lion's head on it. The work guy's muscle. But Thomas Jr., he was there. He gave the orders. He told the muscle to make it look like they were drunk. Stumbled into the lake. That's what he said. Marcus Webb's breathing grew more ragged, a wet, rattling sound. I kept a duty roster for my own records. The night of July 18th, there were 4 names signed in that shouldn't have been. There, contractors, no last names. Just first initials, JD, RT, MK. And LC, I never saw them before or after. That night, only that night, I tore that page out of the logbook after I got the money. Hid it, in the attic. With my old Army medals. My wife doesn't know. Sarah looked at him, really looked at him. The weight of 27 years of guilt and fear was etched into his face. "Where is it, Marcus?" "The roster?" "In a shoebox. Labeled. Vet papers." "In the attic. Upstairs. First door on the right." He coughed. A wet, painful sound. "I'm dying, detective. I can't take this to my grave. The truth. It needs to be with you, now, before it's too late." Sarah nodded. "I'll get it. I'll have someone come with me. Right now." "Thank you," Marcus whispered, his eyes closing. "For Rachel, for David, for Thomas. Tell them I'm sorry. Sarah stood, placing a hand briefly on his thin, papery arm. "I will, Marcus. I promise." She left the room. The image of those terrified teenagers and the cold-eyed young man with the crowbar burned into her mind. The duty roster was the final piece. The names, the initials, the proof that the cover-up wasn't just corporate negligence, but a deliberate act of murder orchestrated by the Benson family and their associates. She walked down the hallway, her steps purposeful, the weight of the case now shifting from a cold, historical tragedy to a present-day hunt for justice. The roster would lead her to the men who had pulled the trigger, to the faces behind the conspiracy. And then the real work would begin. The sun beat down on the exposed lake bed of Cedar Lake on July 25, 2024, turning the mud into a cracked, desiccated plain under the forensic tents and heavy machinery. Detective Sarah Brennan stood beside Dr. Lena Petrova, the forensic anthropologist, watching as the sonar team meticulously scanned the newly exposed area near where the Dodge Caravan had been recovered. The previous day's discovery of the packed tent and personal artifacts had already shattered the official drowning narrative. Now the ground itself was about to yield its darkest secret. The sonar display, a grid of blues and greens on a monitor screen, showed anomalies, not natural formations. Smooth, rectangular shapes buried deep beneath the silt, approximately 200 yards from the van's location, near what had once been the deepest part of the lake. "Too regular," Petrova murmured, her gloved finger tracing the outline on the screen. "Natural sediment doesn't form perfect rectangles. That's deliberate." "Buried deliberately." Brennan nodded, the weight of anticipation a physical pressure in her chest. "Excavate. Grid pattern. Slow. Preserve everything." The operation began with the careful removal of the overlying silt. A tracked excavator, fitted with a wide, smooth bucket, worked in shallow passes, its engine a low rumble in the tense air. Forensic technicians in white Tyvek suits and respirators followed close behind, using hand trowels and brushes to expose the edges. The air grew thick with the smell of wet earth and a faint, acrid tang that Petrova identified as residual lye, the sodium hydroxide from the purchase order Sarah had found in the archives, Section 6. As the top layer of mud was peeled back, the shapes resolved. 3 large industrial drums, identical to those pictured in David Chen's sketches recovered from Amy's attic, Section 4. They were arranged in a tight triangle, their surfaces encased in a thick concrete-like matrix. The concrete was rough, gray, and pitted, stained brown where it met the surrounding mud. It was a tomb. "Containment perimeter established," Petrova announced into her radio, her voice tight. "Potential biohazard. Full PPE required. Approach with extreme caution." The forensic team moved in, setting up a decontamination zone and deploying specialized tools. Diamond-tipped saws, designed to cut concrete without generating excessive dust or sparks, powered by generators humming nearby. Sarah watched from a safe distance, her gaze fixed on the sealed drums. The date on the concrete delivery log she'd found. Section 6, July 20th, 1997. 3:17 a.m. echoed in her mind. 2 days after the teenagers vanished. The lye purchase order dated July 18th. The timeline was undeniable. This was where the cover-up began. The first drum was breached. A cloud of fine gray dust erupted, immediately vacuumed away by a high-powered extractor hose. Inside, partially submerged in a thick, viscous fluid that smelled strongly of chemicals, were human remains. Not bones, not fully decomposed bodies, but the macabre result of immersion in lye and concrete. The flesh had been dissolved, leaving behind skeletal structures, still partially articulated, encased in a dark, waxy substance. A forensic photographer captured every angle. A dental probe was used carefully to extract a tooth for DNA confirmation. Rachel Morrison, Petrova stated flatly after a rapid comparison with dental records provided by the family. Age 17. Cause of death: blunt force trauma to the skull, consistent with the crowbar described in Rachel's tape, Section 5, followed by immersion in corrosive substance. The lye accelerated decomposition, but the concrete preserved the scene. The second drum was opened. Similar remains. David Chen, Petrova confirmed. Age 16, same cause of death, blunt force trauma. Evidence of defensive wounds on the bones. The third drum, Thomas Sutton, Petrova said, her voice devoid of emotion but her eyes reflecting the horror. Age 17, cause of death, ligature strangulation. No defensive wounds. He was likely subdued first. Sarah felt a cold fury wash over her. The tape had ended with Thomas's scream. The crowbar. The cold eyes of Thomas Benson, Jr. It wasn't just an accident. It was execution. 3 teenagers murdered because they dared to expose corporate poison. As the remains were carefully transferred into sealed, biohazard containers for transport to the state lab, the forensic team continued their meticulous work around the concrete matrix. Embedded within the rough concrete, partially exposed by the cutting, was a fragment of paper. It was waterlogged, fragile, but clearly a receipt or delivery docket. Petrova, using delicate forceps, lifted it free. "It's a delivery ticket," she announced, holding it up under a portable light. "From Traverse City Ready Mix. Dated July 19, 1997. Time 11:45 p.m. Destination: Cedar Lake Access Road, Site B. Signed by the driver, Hank Miller." Sarah's blood ran cold. Hank Miller, the retired concrete driver mentioned in her father's notes, the one who claimed his delivery, logs for July 1997, had been destroyed in a basement flood years ago. She'd tracked him down to a small house in Traverse City. A man in his late 70s, frail but sharp. He denied everything, insisting his records were gone. Now here was physical proof of his lie. A delivery ticket preserved in concrete, dated the night before the drums were sealed. Signed by him. Site B, the location of the drums. Petrova carefully placed the ticket into an evidence bag. "This," she said, looking at Sarah, "is the smoking gun. It proves the concrete was delivered to this specific location on this specific night, directly linking the disposal operation to the company and the driver. It's irrefutable." Sarah stared at the sealed drums, now being lifted onto a waiting flatbed truck for transport. The concrete, the lie, the delivery ticket, it was a conspiracy laid bare. Her father's notes, the Polaroids, the tape, the paper trail, the dying guard's testimony, the concrete delivery ticket, it all converged here in this desolate mudflat. The bodies weren't lost in the lake. They'd been buried in it, hidden by the very company responsible for their deaths and the environmental crimes they'd uncovered. The scale of the cover-up was breathtaking, its brutality absolute. The investigation had moved beyond a cold case. It was now a hunt for justice in the face of a meticulously preserved, concrete-sealed lie. The next step was clear: find Hank Miller. The ticket proved he knew the truth, and the truth was about to explode. The exhumation of the concrete-sealed drums began, at dawn under a sky bruised with pre-storm clouds, turning the exposed lake bed into a tableau of grim theater. Forensic anthropologist Dr. Lena Petrova directed the operation with the precision of a surgeon, her voice cutting through the low hum of generators and the rhythmic scrape of trowels. Against concrete, 3 sealed hazmat units stood ready, their biohazard suits gleaming under the floodlights. The air hung thick with the smell of wet earth, chemical residue and something else, ancient decay, sweet and cloying, trapped for 27 years. The first drum, breached by diamond-tipped saws, revealed not bones but a macabre sculpture of dissolution, partially submerged in a viscous, amber fluid. Traces of sodium hydroxide and bodily fats lay the articulated remains of a female. The lie had dissolved flesh but spared bone and cartilage, leaving behind a fragile, waxy skeleton. A forensic dentist gently probed the jaw, comparing dental records laminated on a clipboard. "Rachel Morrison," Petrova confirmed, her voice flat. Age 17. Cause of death: blunt force trauma to the posterior cranium. Defensive fractures on the left radius. The second drum yielded similar horrors. The remains were male, smaller in stature, with a pronounced fracture zigzagging across the frontal bone. David Chen, Petrova stated, lifting a fragment of a hemp necklace fused to the sternum. Age 16. Cause of death: same blunt force trauma. Wrist fractures consistent with struggling against restraints. The third drum held the most chilling evidence. The skeleton was male with a deep, V-shaped ligature furrow circling the hyoid bone. Strangulation. "Thomas Sutton," Petrova murmured, noting the absence of defensive wounds. Age 17. Subdued first. No struggle. As remains were transferred into sterile body bags, a technician called out from the sediment near the base of the third drum. "Detective?" Something metallic. It was a small, tarnished brass key, no bigger than a thumbnail, lodged in the mud beside Thomas Sutton's pelvic bones. Engraved on its bow were the numbers: 47. Not a house key, not a car key, too small for a lockbox. Its purpose remained a mystery, a silent witness to the final moments. The coroner, a woman named Dr. Elaine Vance, whose brother-in-law, Sheriff Hank Peterson, had signed off on the presumed drowned. Report in 1997 oversaw the process with stiff formality. Her hands trembled slightly as she examined Thomas Sutton's hyoid. Ligature marks are consistent with thin wire or cord, she noted, her voice tight. Time of death, consistent with the van's disappearance. Her report would note homicide. But the official narrative of drowning was already irrevocably shattered. Beneath a nearby tent, DNA analysts worked in sterile conditions, matching bone fragments to the family's reference samples. David Chen's mother, May, collapsed into a folding chair, her sobs muffled by a surgical mask. "My baby," she choked out, clutching a faded photograph of David in his AP chemistry lab coat. Rachel's father, Robert Morrison, stood rigidly, staring at the sealed body bag containing his daughter's remains. His knuckles were white where he gripped the tent pole. Thomas Sutton's father, John, simply nodded, a single tear tracing a path through the grime on his cheek. "We knew," he rasped. "We always knew." Petrova held up a fragment of water-stained paper, recovered from the concrete matrix. It was a delivery docket from Traverse City Ready Mix, dated July 19th, 1997, 11:45. The signature was smudged but legible. Hank Miller. The destination, Cedar Lake Access Road, Site B. "This," Petrova said, her voice low, "is the ticket that proves the concrete was poured here, the night after the murders. The driver's logs were lost, but this survived. The rain began to fall then, soft at first, then steady, mingling with the tears of the families and the tears of the earth releasing its dead. The brass key, still tagged as Exhibit 9BI, lay on a stainless steel tray, its numbers gleaming under the harsh lights. It was a key without a lock, a secret without a door, yet its presence here, beside Thomas Sutton, felt deliberate. A message, a warning, or perhaps the first piece of a puzzle that stretched far beyond the lake. Beyond the quarry, beyond the lies of 1997. The exhumation was over, but the truth was only just beginning to surface. The safety deposit box was a small, unassuming metal rectangle in the Traverse City First National Bank's vault, rented under the name Eleanor Morrison since August 1997. For 27 years, Robert and Eleanor Morrison had paid the annual fee without fail, never once opening it, never speaking of it, until now. Sitting across from Detective Sarah Brennan in the bank's sterile interview room, Eleanor's hands trembled as Robert fumbled with the key, a heavy brass thing etched with the box number. The air crackled with decades of suppressed grief and the terrifying weight of what they'd preserved. Robert, once a sturdy man with a carpenter's hands, now looked fragile, his shoulders hunched as if bearing an invisible burden. Eleanor, her face a map of sorrow, finally spoke. "After Rachel, after they were gone," she began, her voice thin and reedy, "we found it. In her room, taped to the bottom of her jewelry box. This key, and a note. Just words. If anything happens to me, this tells the truth. Don't open it. Don't tell anyone. But keep it safe." We didn't understand. We were drowning in grief, but we kept it. Paid the fee every year, hoping we'd never need to. Robert took over, his voice rough with emotion. "Then your father, Tom Brennan, he came to the house. After the official story, he asked questions. About Rachel's camera, about her project. He looked like he knew something wasn't right. But he never pushed too hard. We were scared, terrified of what might happen if we opened it. If we talked, so we stayed silent. Like Rachel wanted, but now the van is found. The bodies, we saw the news. The concrete, it's real," her note. "It's time." With shaking hands, Robert inserted the key into the lock. The mechanism clicked loudly in the quiet room. He lifted the lid. Inside, nestled in faded bubble wrap, lay 3 VHS tapes. Their labels were handwritten in Rachel's distinctive looping script. Quarry Nights, Part 1. Quarry Nights, Part 2. The Night They Took Us. Beside them, a small spiral-bound notebook, Rachel's project log. Sarah carefully lifted the tapes. They were old, the plastic cases slightly yellowed, the labels worn. She opened her forensic kit, gloves snapping into place. "We need to verify these," she stated, her voice calm but firm. "Chain of custody, authenticity." Robert nodded, understanding. Eleanor simply watched, her eyes fixed on the tapes as if they might vanish. The bank provided a VCR in a secure room. Sarah inserted the first tape. It flickered to life, grainy footage shot in near darkness. The familiar outline of the Benson quarry at night, lit only by the headlights of a parked pickup truck. Rachel's voice, younger, more determined, whispered off camera. "Okay. David, you got the samples?" Thomas watched the road. The camera panned across the scene. Stacks of discarded chemical drums, stained earth near the drum pit. The eerie glow David had described in her tape, Section 5. Timestamps confirmed the footage was from July 10, 1997. It was damning visual evidence of the dumping. The second tape continued the pattern. More nights at the quarry, more barrels being moved under cover of darkness, more close-ups of hazardous waste symbols scraped off containers. Rachel's narration grew more urgent. "They're moving faster now. Trucks every night. Someone's scared. I think they know we're watching." The footage showed a black panel van, identical to the one Marcus Webb described, Section 7, arriving late at night. Figures in dark suits unloaded barrels into a pit. Faces were obscured, but the actions were clear. The third tape was different. The timestamp read July 18, 1997, 11:30 p.m. The camera was hidden, perhaps in the bushes near the south gate. The Dodge Caravan was visible, parked as before. Rachel's voice was tense, breathless. "They're here." The ones David called the source. She's scared. She's telling them about the files. The proof. The footage showed Rachel, David, and Thomas meeting a woman in a dark coat near the van. They were talking urgently, gesturing towards the quarry. Then the arrival of the black panel van. 4 men got out, 2 in suits, 2 in coveralls. The scene was chaotic. The woman in the coat ran off into the darkness. Rachel and David were arguing with one of the suit-wearing men. Then the younger man, identified in Section 7 as Thomas Benson Jr., stepped forward. He held a crowbar. Sarah leaned closer, the image grainy but unmistakable. Thomas Benson Jr., then in his late 20s, his face contorted in rage, swung the crowbar. It shattered the driver's side window. Rachel screamed. David raised the camera, recording everything. Thomas Sutton stood frozen, terror on his face. The suit-wearing man with the scar, Section 7, grabbed Rachel. The coveralls grabbed David. Thomas Sutton was dragged towards the panel van, struggling weakly. The footage showed Thomas Benson Jr. smashing the camera with the crowbar. The image went black. The sound of shattering glass, muffled shouts, and the revving of an engine faded into static. The room was silent except for the hiss of the VCR. Robert and Eleanor sat slumped in their chairs, tears streaming down their faces, silent sobs shaking their bodies. Robert looked at Sarah, his eyes hollow with a grief that had just been compounded by fresh horror. That's what happened," he choked out. "They didn't drown. They were murdered. By him, by that monster." He gestured vaguely towards the paused image of Thomas Benson Jr.'s face. Sarah ejected the tape. The notebook lay beside it. She opened it. Rachel's neat script detailed the environmental tests they'd conducted, the names of the officials they'd planned to meet, and a final, desperate entry dated July 18th. "Met the source. She gave us names. Thomas Benson Jr. is involved. He's scared. He's dangerous. We have the proof. If we don't come back, release the tapes. Go to the EPA, make them listen. Don't let them get away with this." Below it, a list of names. EPA Agent Miller, linked to Benson in Section 6. DQ contact Helen Croft and several others. Sarah looked at the parents, then at the paused screen showing the murder. The VHS tapes, preserved in a bank vault for 27 years, were the irrefutable smoking gun. They weren't just evidence. They were Rachel's final testament, her last stand against the corporate and official machinery that had silenced her and her friends. The tapes proved the conspiracy, identified the perpetrators, and shattered the official narrative completely. The next step wasn't just investigation. It was confrontation, and the face staring back from the screen was now a sitting U.S. senator. The stakes had just escalated, from cold case to national scandal. The open thread, the subtle seed for the next story, lay in the final image of Thomas Sutton being dragged, his eyes wide with a terror that mirrored the brass key found. Beside his remains, Section 9, a key that might unlock even darker secrets hidden elsewhere. The town hall meeting in Cedar Lake was supposed to be a celebration. Fresh paint covered the walls. New projection screens flanked the stage, and the air hummed with cautious optimism as residents gathered to discuss the lake's restoration after the drought. Mayor Eleanor Thorne, her smile tight but genuine, welcomed the crowd, emphasizing the new beginning for the community scarred by the van, discovery, and the subsequent exhumation. The room was packed. Locals, reporters, representatives from the EPA and state environmental agencies. At a side table sat the Morrison, Chen, and Sutton families, their faces etched with a grief that had deepened with each revelation. Detective Sarah Brennan stood near the back, not as an official but as a private citizen, a heavy canvas bag at her feet. As Thorne introduced the next speaker, Senator Michael Benson, now looking weary, his face gaunt, stepped to the podium. He began with practiced condolences, speaking of the tragic accident that had haunted our community for decades. His voice was smooth, his words carefully chosen, but his eyes darted toward the families, then toward Brennan. He spoke of Benson Industries' regrettable past and their commitment to transparency, promising full cooperation with the ongoing investigation. The crowd listened politely, a few nodding in approval. This was the official narrative, the sanitized version designed to contain the damage. Brennan waited until he reached a pause, a moment where he gestured toward the screen behind him, showing a rendering of the restored shoreline. That was her cue. She moved toward the stage, her footsteps echoing in the sudden hush. Thorne looked startled, but Brennan ignored her. Placing the canvas bag on the podium, she unzipped it slowly, the sound unnaturally loud in the quiet room. From within, she pulled out a VHS tape, its yellowed label stark against the dark canvas. The night they took us. She held it up. Senator Benson, Brennan's voice cut through the room, calm but carrying the weight of a tomb. This tape contains footage recovered from a safety deposit box rented by Rachel, Morrison's parents, in August 1997. Footage showing the night. Your son murdered 3 teenagers. A collective gasp rippled through the audience. Reporters scrambled, cameras flashing. Benson paled, his composure cracking. That's absurd. It's the truth, Brennan continued, overriding him. She pulled out the second tape. Quarry Nights, Part 2 Twin. This shows illegal dumping at your quarry. This, she held up the third tape. Quarry Nights, Part 1, shows the barrels, the contamination. And this, she placed the tapes on the podium, proves the cover-up wasn't an accident. It was murder. Brennan didn't wait for a response. She turned to the projectionist, a young man from the local paper who had been filming the event. Play this, she commanded, handing him the labeled tape. The night they took us. The screen flickered to life. Grainy night vision footage filled the screen. The Dodge Caravan, the figures arguing, the crowbar shattering the window. Rachel's scream, David's camera falling, Thomas Sutton being dragged. The audio was muffled but clear enough to hear the shouts, the engine revving, and the chillingly calm voice of a younger, Thomas Benson Jr. Make it look like an accident. The room erupted. Shouts of outrage, cries of anguish from the families, the frantic clicking of cameras. Senator Benson stood frozen, his face ashen, staring at the screen as if seeing a ghost. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. Then from the side aisle, a figure stumbled forward. Thomas Benson Sr., the patriarch of the family, looking ancient and frail, leaning heavily on a cane. His face was a mask of anguish and terror. He pushed through the stunned crowd, ignoring the mayor's attempts to stop him, and climbed the steps to the stage. He didn't look at his son. He looked at the screen, then at the families, then at Brennan. Tears streamed down his wrinkled cheeks. It's true, he rasped, his voice cracking, barely audible over the din. All of it. Michael, my boy. He panicked. Those kids, they had proof, real proof. They were going to ruin us, ruin everything. I told him to make it stop, to make it look like they drowned. I paid the guard. I paid Miller to lie about the delivery. I told the EPA to drop the case. I did it. I covered it up. I'm the one who ordered the concrete. I'm the one who buried them in that lake. For 27 years, I carried this weight. And now it's out. He collapsed to his knees on the stage, sobbing, the cane clattering to the floor. Senator Benson stared at his father, then at the screen, then at the seething crowd. The mask of composure was gone, replaced by raw panic. He backed away, knocking over the podium, the tapes scattering. He turned and fled the stage, pushing through the crowd, disappearing out a side exit. The image of his father weeping on the stage. A broken man confessing to decades of murder and corruption. It was broadcast live across the state, then the nation. The consequences were immediate and seismic. Within hours, the EPA held an emergency press conference, announcing a full-scale investigation into decades of environmental violations by Benson Industries and potential collusion with state officials. The abandoned quarry was officially designated a Superfund site, triggering a massive federal cleanup operation. Benson Industries' stock plummeted, facing shareholder lawsuits and criminal investigations. Senator Benson resigned his seat, citing personal reasons, though indictments for obstruction of justice, conspiracy, and accessory to murder were imminent. The Grand Traverse County District Attorney convened a special grand jury. In the town hall, the aftermath was a maelstrom of shock, grief, and grim vindication. The family sat in stunned silence, Robert Morrison finally reaching out to grasp Mei Chen's hand. The crowd's murmurs shifted from outrage to a shared, terrible understanding. The open secret of Cedar Lake, buried for 27 years, was now exposed not just to the town, but to the world. The restoration project was put on hold, replaced by a reckoning that would reshape the community forever. The brass key found with Thomas Sutton's remains, Section 9, lay forgotten on the stage, a silent witness to the truth that had finally broken free. The first Saturday after the town hall, revelation dawned crisp and clear over Cedar Lake. The water had risen 6 inches since the rains began, reclaiming the mudflats with a slow, deliberate grace. Hundreds gathered at the newly designated memorial site. Simple stone circle etched with the names: Rachel Morrison, David Chen, Thomas Sutton, set back from the water's edge. The air hummed with a fragile mixture of grief, anger, and something new, fragile hope. The families stood together near the stone, a united front against the weight of 27 years. Robert Morrison held a worn leather journal, its spine cracked. Mei Chen clutched a stack of faded photographs. John Sutton fingered a brass key. The one found fused to Thomas's remains, Section 9, now polished and mounted on a simple wooden plaque. Sarah Brennan stood near the back, observing the crowd. Local news vans lined the access road, their lenses trained on the scene. The EPA had arrived earlier, erecting informational signs about the upcoming Superfund cleanup. The contrast was stark. The families seeking solace, the machinery of justice and accountability already moving. Robert Morrison stepped forward, his voice raw but steady. "They weren't just our children," he began, the microphone amplifying his words to the silent crowd. "They were Rachel, David, Thomas, dreamers, fighters. They believed the truth mattered, even when it was dangerous." He opened the journal. "Rachel wrote this the week before they were taken." He read her looping script. "The water glows like poison at night. David says the fish are sick. Mom says I worry too much. But if we don't speak, who will? Someone has to make them listen." A collective shudder ran through the assembly. The words weren't just poetry. They were a prophecy fulfilled. Mei Chen took over, her voice thick with an accent that hadn't faded in decades. She held up a photo, David, 16, grinning, a Minolta camera slung around his neck. "David carried this camera everywhere," she said, her gaze fixed on the image. "He said pictures were proof that couldn't be silenced." She read from another journal. "David's this time. Sample number 7, pH32 should be 6585. Mr. Peterson says it's natural variation. But the dead fish don't lie. Rachel says we need to go higher. To someone who can't be bought. The EPA agent we met, he seemed scared, but he took our samples, said he'd look. We have to trust him." The mention of EPA agent Miller, later transferred and linked to Benson, Section 6, landed like a stone in the still air. John Sutton stepped forward, placing the plaque with the brass key on the memorial stone. "Thomas was the quiet one," he said, his voice rough. "But he saw everything. He wrote about the silence, the fear." He read, "They watch us, the men in suits, at the quarry. Rachel says they're scared of us, but I'm scared of them. David says we have to be braver than they are. He says if we disappear, the truth goes live. What does that mean? I hope I never find out." The final sentence hung, a chilling echo of the VHS footage, Section 10, and Rachel's final tape, Section 5. As the families finished, a representative from the EPA stepped to a podium. "The designation of the Benson Quarry and the Cedar Lake watershed as a Superfund site is effective immediately," she announced, her voice formal but carrying weight. "This means a comprehensive federal cleanup operation begins immediately. All records related to Benson Industries, operations from 1995-2005 are under subpoena. We will find every barrel, every document, every person involved in the cover-up. The crowd erupted in applause, a sound that held both relief and the promise of accountability. She added, "And we will ensure the legacy of Rachel Morrison, David Chen, and Thomas Sutton is honored through environmental education grants established in their names." Later, as the crowd dispersed, moving slowly along the shore, Sarah watched Robert Morrison place fresh white lilies on the memorial stone. He lingered, tracing the names with his finger. Nearby, Senator Michael Benson, his face etched with defeat, was escorted by U.S. Marshals to a waiting vehicle. Indictments loomed. The brass key on the plaque caught the afternoon sun. A small, silent promise that even the deepest secrets, sealed in concrete or buried in lies, eventually find the light. The community began its long, hard walk towards healing, the restored lake reflecting not just the sky, but the faces of those who had finally been seen. The cemetery at Maple Hill was quiet under the early October frost, the air crisp enough to crystallize breath into fleeting ghosts. Detective Sarah Brennan pulled her coat tighter, her boots crunching on the gravel path as she approached her father's headstone. Thomas Brennan, 1953-2024, beloved father, dedicated cop. Beside it, fresh white chrysanthemums stood in stark contrast to the browning grass, their petals still damp with dew. She hadn't placed them. She hadn't visited since the memorial service 6 months prior. Her gaze swept the surrounding plots. Empty, then movement. Near the wrought iron fence bordering the woods, an elderly woman in a dark wool coat stood motionless, her back to the graves. She was small, stooped, her white hair pinned tightly under a scarf. She held a single withered branch, perhaps a sprig of sumac, its crimson berries stark against the gray stone. She didn't approach any grave. She simply stood, facing the distant line of trees for exactly 3 minutes. Then, without turning, she melted back into the shadows beneath the oaks, disappearing as silently as she'd appeared. Brennan frowned. She'd seen her before, once a month, like clockwork since the Benson case broke. Never closer than 20 feet. Never facing the camera on the cemetery security pole. Never speaking. Just observing. Leaving flowers? No, these were fresh. Her father's grave. But who? And why the secrecy? Later, in the sterile confines of the Traverse City evidence locker, the focus shifted to the final, overlooked artifact from the Dodge Caravan. The brass key, no bigger than a thumbnail, recovered from the glove compartment sediment, Section 9. Forensic technician Marcus Alvarez held it under a high-resolution magnifier, its bow engraved with the crisp, unmistakable numerals, 47. Initial sweep missed it, Marcus admitted, his voice low. Buried deep in the muck near the emergency brake. Thought it was just corrosion. But the engraving's clean, modern, not a house key, not a car key. Too small for a safe deposit box. Looks like a storage unit key, or maybe a locker. Brennan took the key, its weight cool and solid in her palm. Unit 47, she murmured, testing the words. The local storage facilities she'd checked. The ones listed in her father's files. Only. Went up to Unit 45, and what about the old Benson warehouse? The one on Industrial Park Drive? That place was massive, decades old. They might have had more units. Marcus pulled up a faded blueprint on his monitor. Benson Industrial Park Warehouse Complex. Built 1972. Expansion wing added 1985. Shows. Yes. Storage annex. Ground floor, Section C, units numbered sequentially. Could easily go into the hundreds. Unit 47 would be right here. He tapped a spot near the loading docks. A cold knot formed in Brennan's stomach. The warehouse. The same complex where the black panel van, Section 7, had been seen loading barrels. The same place linked to Thomas Benson Sr.'s confession, Section 11. And now, a key found with Thomas Sutton's effects, pointing to a specific unexplored unit within it. What had the quietest of the 3 teenagers been investigating? What had he seen? What had he hidden? Her phone buzzed. An unknown number. She hesitated, then answered. Brennan? Sarah, it's about your father. The voice was female. Older, strained with urgency. I know why he stopped investigating the Benson case. Not just the cover-up. What he found. What he almost found. It's bigger than you think. Dangerous. Meet me. Tomorrow. Dawn. The old. Benson warehouse. Unit 47. Don't tell anyone. Not even your captain. They're watching. The line went dead. Sarah stared at the brass key in her hand. Then at the security footage still playing. On her laptop, the elderly woman vanishing into the trees. Two threads, one a physical key, the other a cryptic warning, both leading back to the shadowed heart of the conspiracy her father had died pursuing. The Cedar Lake case was closed, the victims memorialized, the powerful brought to account. But Unit 47 waited, and the woman in the cemetery, she knew something. The open door wasn't just a possibility. It was a silent, brass-keyed invitation into a darkness that stretched far beyond the shores of Cedar Lake, into the very foundations of the town's hidden history. The next story had already begun.